Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Edgar Villanueva. I am the principal at Decolonizing Wealth Project and Liberated Capital, and I'm so excited to welcome everyone to a two-part web event on philanthropy's role in supporting the case for reparations. This series is presented by Decolonizing Wealth Project in partnership with Neighborhood Funders Group. As our country heals and pivots forward under a new administration, conversations and actions for reparations from Black and Indigenous communities continue to gain unprecedented momentum. I launched DWP and Liberated Capital with the firm belief that philanthropy has a necessary and critical role to play, not only in grappling with our own wealth, its origins, but also in acting on opportunities for real wealth redistribution. We also have the responsibility to support social movements who are and have been on the front lines of demanding reparations as a key strategy for racial healing and closing the racial wealth gap. At this time, I'd like to invite my co-host, Nal Malloy, to offer a greeting. Welcome, Nal. Let's see. Nal, did you make it on there? You are, brother. Good to see you.
Yes, I'm here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nal Malloy. I am a social justice resource organizer, housing and climate justice advocate, and the principal on a new initiative called Positionality and Power. I'm excited about this conversation predominantly because moving resources to support people of color is a core part of my life's purpose. Like many of you, I was supportive when U.S. Representative Sheila Jackson introduced federal legislation as a path to restorative justice to push the study for slavery and reparations. At the same time, we saw a growing movement of leaders and elected officials in cities like St. Paul, Minneapolis, Portland, Rhode Island, Chicago, and even Vermont explore reparations for Black and Indigenous communities as a form of racial healing after the generations of institutionalized racism. I was so excited to have this conversation about reparations. I immediately reached out to Edgar and his team, knowing that they have provided some foundational information in their work around liberated capital and his book, Decolonizing Wealth. So I'm really excited about their partnership in moving this conversation forward. And I deeply believe that the case of reparations and philanthropy is a sacred prayer and a call to action for our senior leadership and board leaders to continue to do the work and invest in the movement. It's so, for us to leverage grant making and endowment resources to repair, align, deepen, and build a more just future that directly supports Black, Indigenous, and people of color is really critical at this political moment. So I'm excited to participate in this two-part panel discussion series and really excited about the amazing speakers that will be speaking today, talking about the growing reparations movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Nal. Yes, in our session today, one of two parts, we'll be hearing from policy experts and movement leaders from both Black and Indigenous communities on what you as funders need to know about reparations and the calls to address the racial wealth gap. We invite you all to join us on social media to keep the conversations going using the hashtag decolonizingwealth or the hashtag case for reparations. We also are live streaming on YouTube, so pass that on to your social networks that we are also streaming there. Folks are not able to get onto our Zoom session, which is quite at capacity today, which is exciting because this is a very important conversation that we all need to hear. Now it's my honor to welcome Amaka Agbo, CEO of the Katali Foundation and Managing Director of the Restorative Economies Fund, who will moderate our conversation today. Amaka.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Edgar, and deep appreciation to Decolonizing Wealth Project and the Neighborhood Funders Group for having this really important conversation. One of the things that Edgar really lifted up for us is that we're starting to go into a moment of going back to normal, right? So as we kind of welcome in a new administration, as the vaccine continues to roll out, there is almost a desire for folks to return back to the ways that we were kind of navigating life. And that's due to just the weariness of what we've experienced over the last year. And what we also know is that returning back to normal is actually embracing the status quo which has been a normalization of structural racism and systemic inequities. We know the reasons that the pandemic has ravaged Native American communities is due to structural barriers and our deep disinvestment in public health infrastructure. We know that the disproportionate murders and killings of Black and Brown people at the hands of the police is in the form of state-sanctioned violence that has normalized the coordination and adoption of white supremacist ideologies within our policing and criminal justice system. So we know that we actually can't return back to normal. What we're starting to hear from the grassroots is that we need to build back better than before. And in order to do that, we can't turn away from the disturbing truths that 2020 has confronted us with. We actually need to spotlight them and spend time to really focus in on how do we study, how do we engage these structural inequities, and how do we learn from the past in order to inform how we move forward together. Reparations is a word that can oftentimes trigger an emotional response from people that don't fully understand what reparations means. This conversation, the call for reparations and philanthropy, requires us to confront the damning contradiction that the very existence of our sector, the sector of philanthropy, one that seeks to do good and benefits from and reinforces inequities, and it benefits from the growing racial wealth divide and structural racism that disproportionately impacts Black and Indigenous communities. Intuiting the call for reparations into the demand for Build Back Better means that we must reinvest in and reinstore those same communities that have been most impacted by structural racism in order to ensure that, one, we don't repeat the same habits and patterns that got us here, and that two, in order to ensure that those that are closest to the pain and those that therefore have the best solutions have the skills, capacities, and resources that they need in order to actively contribute to and participate in the conversations for how we build back better. With our work at the Kitale Foundation, we believe that it is essential to be intentional about who we invest in, investing in the Black, Indigenous, and communities of color that have been most disinvested in. We think that it is essential to be clear about what we are investing in, projects that seek to close the racial wealth divide and build community wealth. And we also believe that it is important to be just as intentional about how we go about investing in them, investing in right and just relationship with social movements. So to help us deepen our understanding of this conversation on reparations and what it looks like for philanthropy, I'm really excited to welcome our three esteemed panelists as speakers. First, we have Crystal Two Bulls, Director of the Land Back Campaign with NDN Collective. Crystal is based out of Lakota Territory and is also from Northern Cheyenne, from the Lemay Dare, Montana. She has an extensive experience as an organizer on the front lines of the campaign development and management on local, national, and transnational campaigns for social, racial, and environmental justice. We're also joined by Montega Simmons, the Director of the Strategic Partnerships for the Movement for Black Lives. Montega is a native of St. Louis, Missouri, and has worked to build movements locally and nationally that are rooted in building Black political power and self-determination, and advancing the leadership of oppressed nationalities and gender inequities by centering the most marginalized. He's a sitting member of the National African American Reparations Commission. And then we're also joined by Diedrich Asante Mohammed of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. He joined as the Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community in 2019. He oversees the NCRC's National Training Academy, Housing Counseling Network, DC Women's Business Center, and the Racial Economic Equity Team. Diedrich is known for his racial economic inequality analysis, particularly as it relates to the racial wealth divide. So we'd love to invite our speakers to take off their screens, wonderful, and jump into our first discussion question. To kind of set us off, I wanted to invite Crystal and Montega to set the stage in helping us define what is reparations and what does the call for repair and restoration look like from the communities you come from and the communities you work with. And what do you see as the role of philanthropy in seeding reparations for Black and Indigenous communities? Let's start with Crystal and go to Montega.
Awesome. Good morning, Pivawana, everyone. Mayne Wosta Nanehev, Crystal Tubles. Thank you for the introduction. And as far as reparations go, I'm sure folks have heard from our president and CEO, Nick Tilson, and he always says, and this is the best framework I have for defining reparations, is that at the core of reparations is repair, right? And for us, there is no repair without the returning of land. And there's also the idea of making amends, right? And so for Indigenous folks, it's really going back to the root of so many harms that have come and intentional policies and practices that have come to oppress our peoples. And that is, when we were first removed from lands. And almost every social issue that we experience in our communities, we can directly trace back to being forcefully removed from our lands. And so for us, that's what reparations means. It means land back. It means reclaiming literal possession in relationship to land, and reclaiming everything that was taken from us when we were forcibly removed from the land, which includes like language and ceremony and spirituality and healthcare systems and medicines and hunting, so food systems, education systems. And so all of those pieces go back to that. So for us, that is how we look at reparations and how we define that. And I think with, moving into philanthropy and having that conversation in these spaces, it's really important to note that, our analysis is really that this nation and the wealth in this nation is built on stolen land by stolen peoples, right? And so to really look at that and to address that, like those are the pillars that uphold white supremacy in the structures, then we have to start to dismantle that, right? And so I think that that's where philanthropy comes into the conversation as well, is that the wealth that has been acquired also upholds white supremacy, and that is alive and well in philanthropy. And so, we're calling on folks to let go of power and to push those resources into Black and Indigenous led organizations that represent communities and people that are living these experiences that we are trying to address, right? So it can't be folks in boardrooms removed from the communities making these decisions about what is best for our communities. It has to be us. And we know what our communities need most, because we are right here living this every single day. And so for that decision-making power about money to be transferred over to Black and Indigenous folks, that is where we're, that is what we're asking with philanthropy. That is what we're now demanding and calling on, is making that power shift, is to do that, to change the decision-making structure, and to really go beyond 5%, right? Of that the required 5% in philanthropy that, to give to these communities. We're calling on folks to go beyond that. And I think that that's an important conversation to be pushed within these circles and within these spaces. Yeah, I think that's really, kind of like the initial role, and I'm sure we'll dive into more, but that's our definition and the way that I'm viewing philanthropy and reparations.
Good afternoon. My name is Montega Simmons. At its simplest, the Movement for Black Lives defines reparations, again, as the act or process of making amends for wrong. The UN sets out 5 conditions that must be met to be considered full reparations, including cessation, meaning that the harm has to stop with a guarantee of non-repetition, restitution, meaning all parties need to be made whole and reestablished to whatever situation exists before the harm. Compensation has to be provided to by the injuring state or institution. Satisfaction means when previous conditions don't actually result in full repair, satisfaction is also required, meaning that could be an apology, it could be an effort to repair mental or emotional injuries. And then lastly, rehabilitation. That should be provided to include legal, medical, psychological, and other care and services. The Vision for Black Lives that M4BL launched in 2016 sets forth a bold vision of reparations for African descended people in the US and beyond. While we prioritize the demand for reparations for slavery, we don't limit the demand to reparations for slavery. We believe demanding reparations only for slavery erases the reality that the United States has continued to exploit and harm Black people through convict leasing, sharecropping, Jim Crow, redlining, and other policies of structural discrimination and exclusion, and mass criminalization and incarceration through policies such as the war on drugs. We also believe that we have a right to sovereignty over our bodies, our labor, and our communities. We demand abolition and reparations in connection with all the ways and places where this sovereignty has been breached. We demand repair in all places where there is disrepair. We believe that reparations is owed across the African diaspora for all harms associated with colonization, genocide on the continent of Africa, the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of chattel slavery. Slavery and violent oppression, extraction, displacement, exploitation of Black communities aren't just a thing of the past. Our sovereignty and bodily integrity, health, wealth, freedom, rights, and safety have and continue to be violated through ongoing operations of systems of white supremacy, racialized capitalism, ableism, heteropatriarchy, that are all rooted and reinforced by slavery. We're working to illuminate the ways in which these systems and institutions that flow from slavery, including the prison, military, and medical industrial complexes, continue to assert ownership over Black bodies. In regard to our relationship with philanthropy, one, our positionality to policy and what we're fighting, we've shifted from one where we're actually demanding reforms. We want repair, which means for philanthropy, we actually need you to also find courage to step beyond the role of reconstructing the existing systems that continue to damage our bodies and communities. We need for you to actually, and I have to acknowledge, like, the investment level that we see now is not what we saw 10 years ago, but it's still not enough. For forces like the National African American Reparations Commission, which includes bodies like NARC that have toiled around reparations for decades without really finding any support, let alone like new fronts of work like Equity and Transformation in Chicago, who's been working on decriminalization, especially around marijuana, that is embedding reparations in their policies. We need you to find the courage to step into new space and to embrace new visions. And where you see organizations that are not ready to do the work, how do you help level that playing field? How are you actually supporting those folks so they can do the work instead of turning a blind eye on those folks?
Thank you, Crystal and Montega, for just kind of setting the stage. I think what you really helped to lift up is that the call for reparations is not just about the economic redistribution of resources, but it's also about ensuring that Black and Indigenous communities of color have the political power and autonomy to have agency over their lives and livelihoods. And that within that, the culture of these communities need to be grounded in what is true for those specific populations. And so thanks for just lifting up the integration of what that looks like as we go from community organizing to policy, but also transforming into the future world that we want to create. I'd like to move the conversation now on to Diedrich. I'm hoping that you can spend some time really setting the stage for us in terms of what we witnessed coming out of the 2020 uprisings in response to the murder of George Floyd. There has now been an uptick in conversations about reparations on both the local and federal levels. And Montega just kind of started to take us through what some of those conversations have started to look like. I'm wondering if you can give us an overview of what is emerging on the federal landscape in terms of the conversations, the studies, and the policies that have started to happen around what reparations could look like and what it means for Black and Indigenous communities and their respective social movements.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and the stage very much has been set. I think one thing I like to make a distinction between reparations and overall calls for bridging racial inequality. I think reparations generally should be focused on a federal action to address, and in this case, it seems like we're talking about African Americans and Indigenous people, and repairing the kind of harm that has been happening for centuries. So I do like to distinguish that because I think it can get confusing when people refer to reparations as a foundation is doing reparations. I mean, a foundation might be interested in funding reparations advocacy, and that's great. You know, a foundation might be interested in investing in bridging racial economic inequality, which is very important, you know, and that is kind of where I focus my I usually say when I do presentations, the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. So I do see racial economic inequality and racial wealth divide as central indicators to help us understand if the reparations really is repair. It wouldn't be the only indicator, but I would say central, because I think, reparations can be to some people an apology. It could be to some people some political action, but we haven't really been repaired. And I think one of the kind of easiest ways to quantify is looking at economic inequality, wealth inequality, and understanding that as a basis to see how far along we are getting in repair. So that is, kind of the basis in which I look upon reparations. And I guess I'll just note, I do also believe that, the reparations has obviously been a ongoing movement up and down, probably since the first kind of successful attack by Western European colonizers on the indigenous lands and enslavement of African people. There's always been, requests for reparations. There have been different movements asking for it. I was interested that even before the George Floyd incident, that we saw Democratic candidates mentioning reparations in their platform, which used to be I'm old now, I'm in my mid 40s, but when I was in my 20s, only the most radical organizations would even mention reparations, right? Jesse Jackson could barely mention reparations in 1988 when he was running as at that time, the most kind of radical Black presence on the presidential stage. So I think there has been different movements. I think, I found it very interesting you titled this philanthropy and the case for reparations, because I do believe Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece, The Case for Reparations, did help once again raise up reparations as an issue that needed to be discussed, and not just about slavery, but about the kind of inequality that's been happening and continues to happen. So I think we have seen, more and more conversations about it. And so I think now it's really important to focus in, what do all of us as different groups mean by reparations? How can we work better together to make sure that it is some type of repair, not just a Bill Clinton conversation about race, or or small dollar amounts, given out to to people as a way to symbolically appease, but not to really bring the repair we're all looking for.
Thank you for breaking that down. I think to really tease out what you really pointed us towards is that there must be structural reinvestments into systems that are inherently equal and just. And so the importance of policy and the ways that we move money to really address those structural inequities. To kind of go back to Crystal and Montega, I'm wondering if you could take a moment to provide us with a historical overview of what the solidarity between Black and Indigenous communities has looked like in the past, and how are those acts of solidarity and collaboration present in our current social movements today, and why do you think that this is important as we kind of partake on this conversation with reparations? Maybe we can start with Montega and then go to Crystal.
Like, frankly, and I have to acknowledge in this place, like, this is a place I'm not well schooled. I know that there have been examples from our folks that actually were able to find survival with each other, like in tribes like Seminoles in Florida, in islands along the eastern coast of South Carolina. What we did in those spaces was often, unfortunately, matched by settler colonialists pitting us against each other to both hunt down like escaped slaves, or let alone to move native tribes from their inherent land. Currently, like, part of what's actually been happening has been a level of reconciliation. Like, our folks have actually been talking and building not only toward acknowledging like our shared harm under settler colonialism, but toward a different lens and relationship with land. And this is a place, like, one, I'm hoping that Crystal can help unpack a little bit more of like a new vision of like how we're thinking about these things. But I know we do actually work in several shared spaces, from the Rising Majority to the Black Land Trust, and other spaces where we're actually, one, wrestling with questions around our own connections to land, and hopefully shifting and transforming the way that these things can look in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that, Montega. I mean, I grew up hearing stories, about these relationships in terms of like Rainbow Coalition and really looking at the American Indian movement and the Black Panthers and the relationships that had existed there. And I think that, you know, what we're seeing now is that we're reestablishing those relationships in very deep, meaningful ways because of the political climate that we're in, right? And I think that a lot of times as Indigenous folks and as a Native woman, I think it's really important to acknowledge that a lot of the momentum in the power built, in the organizing built by Black relatives is something in the momentum that we've been able to catalyze off of and push our struggles and our movements forward as well. And so really just want to acknowledge that. And it's the same now, you know, myself, I'm someone who was, you know, I was arrested on July 3rd, and that was the catalyst for the land back movement. However, you know, we have to acknowledge the fact that the July 3rd action at Mount Rushmore, where we, you know, called out Trump and Trump supporters for trespassing on Indigenous lands, you know, that was only able to happen because of the organizing by Black relatives that had been happening with George Floyd and with the tearing down of colonial statues all across the country. And there was momentum that was built in calling out white supremacy and how these statues continue to uplift and to glorify that, right? And so we were able to move on that momentum and to look in and to point at Mount Rushmore being the ultimate shrine of white supremacy in the heart of the Black Hills, which is sacred lands for us. And so I think it's really important to like name those relationships and name that our movements and our struggles have always been in relationship to each other, and that there's a lot of deeper conversations that do still have to happen, right? And that we need to continue to dive into. And I think that's one thing that I really appreciate about the Land Back campaign and about Indian Collective is that we are deeply invested in deepening our relationships with our Black relatives around these conversations and really you know, looking at what does a conversation about addressing anti-Blackness in our own communities look like, you know, and we're invested in that, and we're having those conversations internally as a team. We're preparing to have public facing conversations around those as well, you know, and just really looking at doing and owning that and really looking at how we have to heal together. And so in this framework of like reparations and making amends and healing and how that plays in, you know, like I think we do have to continue to lean into the tough conversations and to really lean in and address like healing from trauma that has come from all of these different lived experiences, right? And so I think that's one way that I see that continuing to happen is because as Montega mentioned, like we're in many spaces together and we're constantly in these conversations, and I hope to continue to be in these and to deepen that and to continue to create space specifically for them to happen. And I think that, you know, we see that these relationships, we are able to identify intersections of our work, right? So work around like abolition, work around reparations, work around land back, and really looking at like, what does a future with Indigenous land back and Black reparations look like? What does a future with Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation look like? And so really spending time in spaces together to envision what that can be, and leaning into those conversations that lead up to that. And so we're currently doing that, and we're currently in many spaces together, and I'm appreciative for that. And so I think that's the way that I'm seeing it play out within Land Back campaign specifically.
And if I could jump in for a second, that's okay. You know, one thing I would just like to also kind of note is I think we're still at, even though there's more popular discussion around reparations, I'm not clear how popular discussion is around land back, but hopefully that will become more popular as well. I do think we're still at the very beginning phase within the African American community of like, now that there is more conversation, now you have many different, well, you have different people, you know, different organizations fighting for different types of reparations. Most people not really clear that, not even feeling that it's possible. So I think there has to be a lot of dialogue internally in the communities, before this idea, not necessarily before, but that it's not like there's a strong African American understanding of this is what reparations is. There's a strong Indigenous, and now these two sides just need to talk. There's still a lot of internal conversations we have. One thing I want to point out is I remember reading how Joe Biden was against reparations, and then he made some comment, I think in the fall, about, well, if there's going to be reparations for African Americans, there has to be reparations for Indigenous people. But the way he said it made it seem almost like he was throwing up a stumbling block. Like, not that he was serious, because I mean, if that's the only negotiation, fine, yeah, good. let's do it. Done. We can do it for indigenous people and African Americans, but there will be this, I think, idea of how to play communities against each other. And I really appreciate the framing here around land back and reparations to kind of help us maybe make some distinctions of that these communities are in different situations, have different needs, have some shared situations, and there might be different movements that are allies, but they're not the same thing. So I just think that's important.
Yeah, thank you for lifting up that piece, Diedrich. I think what I would just offer from what Montega and Crystal have shared as well is that we are inviting philanthropy to observe a conversation around how do we hold the complexities and the distinctions between what Black and Indigenous communities have experienced at the hands of white supremacy in the United States. And what we also know to be true is that Indigenous communities are not a monolith, and Black communities are not a monolith. And so how do we also kind of honor the ways that communities in their particular places are calling for reparations based on their specific needs and conditions? And so to kind of move us into this next piece, Diedrich, you've done a lot of great work around the racial wealth divide. And so I'm wondering if you could start to kind of link the conversation around reparations to the indicators that you lifted up around the racial wealth divide. And what do you see as the critical strategies that really help to link these two issues and start to move us into that space of repair?
Great. I would love to dive into that. Just one other thing I want to note, I feel like I should, is that also I think a place that Indigenous communities and African American communities can, start thinking of, utilize to help have better conversations with each other are Black Indigenous people, right? Like there are like Black Indigenous communities, communities and people. My wife is a Black woman who is a registered member of the Nanacoke Lenni Lenape tribe. And so, that is a place where there could be, a way to help bring our struggles more together. As with the racial wealth divide, I've done a lot of writing and research as with African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans. I do think it's interesting. There are distinctions, but if you look at generally nationally, you do find very similar national unemployment levels for African Americans as compared to Native Americans nationwide. You do, a lot of people think of Native Americans, Indigenous people solely on reservations, but people who study this know that most Indigenous people are in urban areas and cities. And historically, African Americans have been historically in urban areas as well. They have actually very similar national income. So I do think there's a lot as in the study of racial economic inequality and racial wealth divide to get a better understanding of what type of national investments could actually make a substantive improvement in the lives of these people. There is so little data out there around Indigenous people, particularly as it relates to wealth. Wealth, there's not a lot of research, and oftentimes the papers I work on are mostly about Blacks and Latinos, sometimes Asian Americans, but there's really not, I haven't seen it, at least, good national data on Indigenous people. That's one thing I think philanthropy could do, is they could really focus the much more painstaking study and not just depend on general federal stats in order to really figure out, what this situation is, and even doing serious studies about what type of programs and investments do we think would have the biggest effect in bridging this racial wealth divide. I think an important piece about the racial wealth divide is it really helps us change the frame. Some people will be in denial that there is no racial inequality. Other people recognize there's racial inequality, but will say, well, we're getting there, we're doing better. We had a Black president at one point, we have a Black woman, South Asian vice president, so we're on the path. But if you look at wealth numbers, you see that no, there isn't a bridging of racial wealth inequality between Blacks and whites and Latinos and whites. It's actually growing. So we're on a pathway of ongoing apartheid, economic apartheid. And so I think, again, I think that's so important because it helps us recognize why we need reparations. We don't need just reparations for theoretical healing. We need it to stop the material distinction, which really maintains racial inequality and is keeping us deep in this reality of white supremacy in the 21st century, right? Like you don't need MAGA protesters and Confederate flags for white supremacy. You have white supremacy all around you all the time.
Yeah, I'm just sitting with that. I think one of the things I really appreciate about what you just lifted up as well is is the balance between needing the information, the data to inform how we build back better and how we move forward. And one of the things that Crystal has been lifting up and speaking to is the Land Back campaign, the work of NDN Collective. And so would love to start to pivot to Crystal, if you could spend some time telling us a bit more about the work of the Land Back campaign. And I think this is particularly important because while we talk about reparations from a racial wealth redistribution strategy, particularly around capital, we also know that land is a particular resource that is a non-renewable resource, but should be stewarded and preserved for the public good. And so wondering if we'll start with Crystal and go with Montega to speak about what is the importance of land liberation to the work of your communities, both with the Land Back campaign and the work of Black Land and Power. Well, how is land a critical aspect of the call for reparations? And then how should we start to think about the distinction of land redistribution from capital redistribution and resourcing the strategy work for Black and Native communities? So it's a lot of questions layered in once, but tell me about land and why it's important to your fight for liberation.
Yes, thank you, Emeka. It is a lot there. So first, just I'll give a brief summary of like the Land Back campaign, which, is a pretty massive campaign that we've taken on. And so there's Land Back, the meta narrative, right? So Land Back that really pushing forward, and that is something that, like the Land Back meta narrative and the movement, there's been organizing happening around that since the first settlers hit these shores and removed us from lands, right? So we have been organizing around reclaiming relationship to land since settlers first got here. And so it just may not have always been called that. And so really acknowledging that we're stepping into a long legacy and generations of work that have been done for us to remain connected and related to the land, right? And so with the campaign, what we did is really step into this work and think about how we can contribute and to support this meta narrative and push that forward and to support the movement itself and the organizing that is happening all across Turtle Island and frankly, globally. And so we really looked at that and we launched our traditional campaign. And that's the first side. And that's really where we're addressing shutting down Mount Rushmore and reclaiming public lands in the Black Hills, right? We're not asking for co-management. We're not asking for any of that. We're saying return the management of those lands back to Indigenous peoples. And what we're saying is that we have been managing these lands since time immemorial, but that was stripped from us when we were forcefully removed. And so what we're trying to do is work towards the reclamation of that responsibility and that caretaking duty that we have to the land. And that's really what is at the premise of it. And that is starting with public lands. There's a lot of fear around when people say land back, especially in this region, in this area that we're at, of oh, we're coming for people's houses, or oh, we're coming for people's private property. And that's not the case. We're actually focused on public lands in the Black Hills right now. That is our primary focus, and shutting down Mount Rushmore, because that is, a shrine to white supremacy. And if we're going to address the idea that land in traditional territories were stolen from us, then we have to address white supremacy, and we have to address those statues and those monuments that continue to uphold that. And so that is why Mount Rushmore is still in that. The second part of our campaign is really focused on movement support. So Indian Collective is an organization that is able to hold these campaigns and to support in that we are able to resource them. We are able to amplify voices that are on the front lines, folks that are right there fighting. Oak Flat being one of those communities, right, that is fighting very specifically to maintain relationship to ceremonial lands that they have, that John McCain slipped into a bill and gave to a foreign mining company. And so land theft is something that is like ongoing. It's not a historic event. It's not something that's in the past. It's actually something that's continuously ongoing. And so, we're able to amplify and uplift those voices. And we're also able to connect land back organizing that's happening all across the country. And, going to the north and going down to the global south as well, we're able to connect these fights. And so those are really the two parts of the campaign. But also what it's at the heart of it is really holding this narrative that and this is what really connects us to a lot of other movement spaces, but really holding the narrative that we go back to the doctrine of discovery, right? Which was like the legal mechanism that allowed for land theft on our lands and in many other nations. But when talking about the United States specifically, you know, that was the legal mechanism that basically said if there are no Christians here, then that land can be claimed on behalf of a kingdom or a monarch, right? And so we go back to that. And then what we go from there is that to remove us from those lands and to claim those lands, the US military was the one that had to remove us. And that is where we experienced massacres and where we experienced attempted genocide and all of the horrific things that happened to our peoples for them to get access to resources and land. And so really looking at that is like, we have to take an anti-war and an anti-militarist approach if we're gonna look at this as well. And then we have to look at the fact that that template of settler colonization and militarism being the enforcing mechanism is the template that is then used for US imperialism to gain access to other lands and to gain access to other resources over the oceans and overseas, right? In other indigenous lands. And so really looking at it, it's a really simplified way of looking at US imperialism and colonization, militarism, but it's also, you know, a core of what we believe with the Land Back campaign. And so I think for us, if we are really going to move into this decade of repair, if we are really going to look at reparations, then we have to go back to the root cause of that. And that is when we were forcefully removed from our lands. That is when we can trace almost every social issue that our communities have back to when we were removed from the land. The loss of our languages, healthcare, right? Like our healthcare system is ridiculous, but also like we have high rates of like obesity and diabetes and all of these illnesses that are like food related and land-based related. If we have access to lands and we have reclamation of those relationships and we reestablish our traditional healthcare systems, our traditional food systems, our traditional education systems, then many of these social issues that are impacting our communities are at least starting to get healed, right? Not saying that that is like the one answer for everything, but saying that it is a starting point. And so for us, that is why Land Back is so key and core to our liberation work and to our organizing work. And that is why the Land Back campaign is this campaign that is really an umbrella that is able to hold climate justice, racial equity, education equity, all of these things that we are currently organizing around in our communities. Land Back is this umbrella that is able to actually connect those, right? Into really like a narrative that we're able to hold and to push forward. And I think in even recognizing that, it's important to name that when we're talking about land, you know, and we're talking about our land and things like that, it's not ownership in a Western like colonial context, it's relationship. And it's caretaking responsibilities that were original instructions put into us when we were put on this earth. And we believe that. And so when looking at land, we don't look at land as like capital or as a resource or as any of that. We look at land as a relative, and in many communities as a mother, as this like providing and life-giving source, right? And so that is how we look at it. And so if we are really going to be looking at you know, liberation and looking at decolonization for us, that means like, how do we address land? How do we have this conversation? But I think it is important that, you know, we also are realistic in the fact that we are organizing to purchase land, right? Like we are supporting communities to be able to purchase back traditional territories, to reclaim land base. And that leads to us reclaiming relationship. And that leads to all of the reclamation of all of the other, you know, food systems and medicines and whatnot that were disconnected from us when that happened. And so that is really why, you know, Land Back is at the core in, you know, in how we define land and how we define our relationship to land and how we speak about it is really important and significant in these spaces as well.
Thank you for that master class on how we think about and engage land as it relates to our collective liberation. And I think it's fitting that we're also having this conversation the day when we're all eagerly awaiting when Deb Haaland will actually be appointed as Secretary of the Interior. I think one of the humbling statistics I learned a couple of years ago was that 80% of the world's biodiversity is stewarded by Indigenous communities. that only hold 20% of the world's land. And so when we think about what it means to have our collective liberation intertwined with each other and why it's important to really honor and lean into this call for land back and support the work of organizations like the Sogorea Land Trust that's really lifting up the rematriation of land, or work like the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative that's figuring out how do we start to develop mechanisms that, like you're saying, Crystal, allow us to reclaim and then steward land in that true vision for public benefit for the long term. Montega, we've also seen efforts like the National Black Food and Justice Alliance's work on Black Land and Power and the Black Farmers Fund and so many other efforts. I'm curious if there's anything that you would like to add in terms of how Black-led organizations are also engaging in this conversation around land stewardship.
Sure. So for us, the demand for land as a part of reparations goes back at least to Special Order 15, a wartime order proclaimed by General Sherman in 1865 during the Civil War to allot land to some free families in plots that were supposed to be no larger than 40 acres. And then those folks, some of who actually took possession of those lands, were systematically dispossessed of those lands. Then again, in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, Congressman Thaddeus Stevens called for the transfer of 400 million acres to former enslaved Africans. And in addition, Charles Sumner called for land grants to those who actually received or were recently enslaved, because legal equality did not eradicate the disparities in assets and power. 100 years after that, Queen Mother Adlai Moore called for land reparations in addition to back pay for descendants of slaves. Amongst the folks that she stewarded were the Black Panther Party and the Republic of New Africa, who at the core of its demands advocated for the creation of a separate nation for Black folks, a new Africa, so to speak, by carving out the 5 Black Belt states in the Deep South. When you mentioned before the group Black Land and Power, like this is what they're inheriting. This is where they're actually finding themselves, like in the continuum of struggle around. In this moment, they're actually working to build on that legacy by building infrastructure to provide and share technical skills, resources, legal support, and organizing strategies amongst their network. And they're actually working to take land off the speculative market and move it into the commons, and thereby build power and create spaces for healing, health systems, agroecology, farming, food systems, education, organizing spaces, arts, sanctuary, sacred space, and community safety. And also in this moment, we can't forget that recently there was also an introduction of Senate Bill 4929, which has a potential to finally transfer up to 32 million acres, which is still a fraction of what our folks originally owned, back to Black farmers who were illegally dispossessed. In saying all that, like one, I do want to just restate that M4BL as abolitionists, like we believe what is required is a transformation of all these systems and institutions and structures that continue to oppress us, and a systemic shift in the way that we actually relate again to land and these structures. So we call for solidarity amongst not only demands made by African descendant people, but we support the calls for reparations for colonization and genocide of indigenous people, and for theft of land explicitly in the United States.
I have one question for Diedrich before we go into our closing round. Diedrich, I'm wondering if you have thoughts around the word reparations as we start to kind of close out. Part of what we hope to do with this conversation is to make the word and the movement more accessible for those that have been leaning out. And so do you have thoughts around one, how we make the word more accessible and less triggering, and if that is even a conversation we should be leaning into or not? And then the second part is, how do you think philanthropy should really be showing up in this moment as well to support the federal movement around the studies that are coming up around reparations? How should we really make sure that we galvanize this moment and really advance the conversation?
Well, thank you for those questions. And I really did appreciate Crystal's breakdown of land back. I think there's so much that for someone myself who's been focused more on African American reparations can learn from that. I mean, even connecting land to relations. And I think in the African American context, part of our true repair, that might not be in the financial repair, true repair will be connecting with the African diaspora, with African ancestors, brothers and sisters, as well as the Caribbean, and thinking that through in the reparations space. This idea of making reparations less triggering, I wouldn't focus too much energy on that, because I mean, people are triggered by ending white supremacy. Well, they need to be triggered because we want to end white supremacy. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, though I do like this idea of framing more land back and reparations in that, because I think they give reparations in most people's minds is so much rooted, though many people have had reparations all over the world and what have you, but in the US context, it's so much connected to the African American context. And I think it gives, I think African Americans want land back too, as been laid out and historically has. And I think Indigenous people also want some ideas that are associated with reparations, because even if you get land, you need the finance to maintain the land, right? So I think putting these two things together will kind of help show a unity, but also, some differences. And so I like that idea of tying those things together more, land back and reparations. And for, foundations and such, I mean, one thing, yes, I would like foundations to more publicly say, we are for reparations as a foundation, and this is the work we're funding to advance, advocacy in reparations. Also that, also too, and maybe the foundations on this call are all doing amazing work, but it's not really clear to me that we have the measures of, what foundations are making sure that the majority of their funds go to Black and Indigenous-led organizations, or 30%, or whatever their number is, right? What percentage of your procurement dollars, what percentage of the funds you give out are actually working with Black or Indigenous-led or organizations? So I think developing a even kind of progressive wing of, here are the standards of racial equity that we're putting forward that we want, foundations across the country to follow, can also be something that we can look for corporations and what have you. So I think it's not just in funding advocacy, it's also in the programmatic work they fund and what standards they're holding themselves to say, yes, we are really doing the changes needed to address these serious issues that are going in the wrong direction, regardless of who's in the White House.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking on the piece around the word reparations and not shying away from it, because then, we don't show up to the task at hand. In a moment, I'm going to kind of invite our panelists to go into their brief closing round of comments. But to the invitation that you lifted up, Diedrich, around what foundations are doing, I would be remiss if I didn't lift up the work of the Katali Foundation. We are really honored to work with a team of practitioner funders where we have explicitly committed the reinvestment of our resources to Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And being able to do that in a way in which we're not only building their economic power once again, but ensuring that we're supporting projects that are helping to really shift those systems and create long-term self-determination and sovereignty. And so we're honored to be able to support the work of a number of different organizations from across the country that are deeply committed to actually transforming these systems of inequality. And so would love to invite other foundations as well to really lean into this mission, this invitation, and dare I say this demand from the grassroots to fund the organizations, fund the community organizing, the policy advocacy, and the community wealth building projects that are deeply rooted in this vision for collective liberation. And so for our closing round, we'll start with Montega, go to Crystal, and then close out with Diedrich. If you could lift up, what are some actionable steps that philanthropy can start to take today to advance the conversation? What are some of the projects or initiatives that you're excited to be a part of, to lift up, that we may not have heard you share about today?
I think I did sneak some of them in already. But for me, there are two fronts. Mainly one, there is a national push around HR 40 that we see reflected not only in federal government, but we've also seen cases pop up in both Tulsa, Evansville, and then different municipalities around the country. Those are literally supported by organizations that have very limited resources. In addition to that, we've seen innovations in terms of the way that folks are fighting for justice, say for police crimes, criminalization, mass incarceration, that includes reparative frames. And the example that I pointed to before was Equity and Transformation in Chicago, when they actually first were able to pass legislation around marijuana decriminalization. They also expunged the record of more than 150,000 people and had them released from prison. That was part of the repair that had to had to be enacted in order for the legislation to be passed.
Thank you, Montega. So, I mean, I think obviously Land Back campaign is a massive campaign, but also just Indian Collective as a whole is an organization that is well prepared and well equipped to be able to take on resources and to be able to manage that. And then we're also an organization that is directly in relationship with communities, like frontline communities, frontline organizers. I myself came into this work as an organizer, so philanthropy isn't really the world that I live in. You know, it's more frontline activism and organizing. And I can definitely say that, you know, living in a space of like project-based funding that flows down to other organizations is not helpful. I think that's something that I really picked up on. And so I think that, like, you know, stop doing project-based funding and telling us the kind of work that we should be doing and having us fit into those types of funding models, but rather stepping aside and really like transitioning the decision-making power over to letting us say what we are going to work on, and that funding and that money is not attached to any other requirements besides what we know is the work that needs to be done on the ground in our communities, based in our knowledge, in our traditions and our prayers and our ceremonies as well. And so I think that's also something, and I think that Indian Collective is an organization that is primed and equipped and prepared for that. You know, Land Back campaign is not our only campaign. We have racial equity, education equity, and we also have a climate justice campaign. So those are the 4 areas that we're completely focused on right now that intersect, but also, you know, work in their own regards. But we also have the Indian Fund. And so we are, just the same way that we can manage grants in that, we are equipped as well to take in loans and to be able to work on that level too, with like the mission related and program related investments as well. And so just naming that piece of that work with Indian Collective, and that we're able to actually do that, and that work and that those monies go directly into like food sovereignty programs in the time of COVID, mutual aid networks, you know, that re-envision the way and reimagine the way systems can actually serve people, and not the current systems that we have that only serve certain people, right? And so really looking at investing in those and in land trusts and whatnot. And so, you know, I think that's the big thing that I would push for, and obviously the line of work that I'm deeply invested in at the moment.
All right, and we have 30 seconds, so let me just, you know, I don't know the foundation world that well, but if there is not already a coalition of foundations that, you know, there should be a coalition of foundations that want to push for land back, reparations, and repair. And they should come together and they should share promising practices, best practices on how they are supporting land back work, or let's say land back advocacy, reparations advocacy, as well as what type of programmatic work they're funding and what standards they're holding themselves to make sure that their funds are actually hitting Black and Indigenous people, whether within the foundations or within their general spending. So some type of coalition, or utilize a coalition that already exists to help hold themselves to these standards, highlight these standards, and so it can grow, hopefully, to foundations across the country and nonprofits and private corporations and governments. I will stop there because I know we're over time.
Thank you so much to our panelists, and to Diedrich's last point, I do know Neighborhood Funders Group is really committed to providing that philanthropic support to a number of different philanthropies. And so hope that can continue to be a space where we're leaning into the invitation to decolonize wealth. And so would love to kind of hand it back off to Edgar to close us out. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. I wish I had more time to be more explicit in my gratitude, but thanks to our panelists. I do want to say there is a lot of movement happening inside of philanthropy to organize around these issues. So please continue to follow their resources. Decolonizing Wealth Project and Liberated Capital, we are working alongside NFG and others, Katali Foundation, to think about how we can resource reparations and support the movement. I just want to again thank everyone and remind you that to join us in part 2 of this conversation on March the 18th at 1 o'clock Eastern time, where we will talk with a panel of funders who are taking on the call to reparations, and thinking about how to operationalize that lens in their grant making strategies. We have some big announcements that will be made on March 18th, so you don't want to miss that. If you register today, then you are automatically registered for the next event. So you will be getting email reminders about that. If you're watching us on YouTube or some other streaming and you want to register and be reminded about part 2, there will be a link put in the YouTube channel on Decolonizing Wealth Projects page. So thanks everyone. Keep the conversation going on social media. And yes, the recording will be on YouTube for the Decolonizing Wealth Project. You can find it there. Much appreciation.